great teacher he is, and the fact that he is a statewide kind of really actioner for the benefit of GLBT history. Is that right? And so I think that may have important consequences for school curricula in years to come. Dr. Romesburg, let's give him
All right.
When you play video, turn it off.
Okay. Hey, I don't know why it's yelling at me now, but okay. So I talk loud, so if you need to turn it down. Otherwise, I'll be yelling at you the whole time. Okay, so today we're going to be... that sounds so loud to me. Does it sound loud to you? No? Okay, good. So today we're going to be talking about masculinity. And a lot of times... when we talk about women's and gender studies, which is the field where I am currently chair of the department in Sonoma State University, when we talk about women and gender studies, when we talk about feminism, we tend to think of it as being about women and about equal rights for women being treated as full humans, for the ways in which men oppress women. And we're certainly going to be exploring something about male privilege today and about patriarchy. But I really want to center on how gender studies gives us a lens, a crucial lens, for understanding how masculinity is a central concern for all people, and for men in particular, how it is that we navigate the questions and challenges of masculinity really structures a lot about who we are and how we are in the world. So we're going to be doing that in a few different ways. I'll go through this in a bit, but you'll notice I have these little things throughout, so keep an eye out for them. They're little like Easter eggs that tell you how to write your paper for this week, okay? I figured I'd put those there so you just you knew how to do it. You should all get full credit this week. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about women's and gender studies in general, because I think many of you probably don't know what it is as a field. You don't come to college necessarily thinking, I'm going to take that as my major, so I'll talk about that. I'll talk about gendered power and what we know about it, how it operates, what masculinity has to do with that. Then I'm going to go on and say some more about particular ways in which men navigate masculinity and its challenges and opportunities. And then finally, what we might do to combat or confront some of the most toxic elements of what masculinity does to us and to others. And so that's going to be what we're doing. Along the way, I'm going to talk about American-born Chinese as well, and give you a little argument there. Before we get to that, I just want to start with these three images here up front. What do you think that any of these three images, what do they say about masculinity, do you think? If you're reading these as sort of, right, images that tell a story, what story of masculinity do any of these tell? You can take your pick. Like, I know you're all going to want to talk about this one because they always do, right? So what story of masculinity does this image tell? So this, by the way, is an image that I grabbed many years ago by searching Google for Sonoma State men party. And then I found this Google image popped this up, right? So forevermore, this poor person is in my masculinity talk. Okay, so what is the story? What's the story of masculinity here? What literally is this? What's happened here? Like, what happened in this photo? Yes. Okay, right. He blacked out. We have to assume that this is like that he wasn't like, I'm going to close my eyes. Can somebody draw a dick on my face, right? So we have to assume, right, that he blacked out, right? And somebody drew a dick on his face, a little nose, unibrow, right? Wrote penis across the top in case anyone wasn't clear on what the image was, right? And I assume that word is whore there, right, on the side there. Okay, so what's funny about this? What's the joke? Whether or not you find it funny, what's the joke here? Yeah. Okay, right, but they could have wrote like, you're awesome, great student, right? And like a butterfly, right? So there's something more specific than there's something on his face. Yes?
Like humility?
Humility or humiliation? Like humility is like, oh, I want to be like centered and like humiliation. Okay, so there's something humiliating about this. Okay, so what's humiliating about it and why is that funny? Way in the back, Bobby. Right, because it's hilarious, right? Because why would a guy want a dick in his mouth, right? Oh, it's so funny. Okay, right. Okay, right. And how humiliating, right, that a guy would have a penis near his mouth, right? Okay, ha, ha, ha. So, right, so that's the joke, right? That's the joke, right? And then the other part of the joke that's there is that guys are supposed to be in control of themselves at all times, right? Guys should be able to party hard but hold their liquor, right? Guys should always be able to take a joke when they're made to feel the butt of the joke and take it in stride as well, right? So this guy's got to not only sort of face this down, right? I assume it's permanent marker, right? Face this down, but take it in a way that shows that he's a man, that he can take a joke, right? That his ego has not somehow been injured in some way by this experience, right? So there's a lot about masculinity that's going on in just this one picture, right? I put these other images up here because I wanted to say, right, thank goodness this isn't all that masculinity is about, right? If it was, we'd all be leading a very stark existence, right? It's also about thinking about, like, what do we want to be? What do we want masculinity to be? How can we enact what we want masculinity to be through ourselves and through the way that we relate to others, right? Guys and girls. And then finally, right, right, I'm guessing this is from like just based on the if you can call it fashion, right? College boy fashion, right? Like probably 2005 or something, right? But, right, guys hanging out with guys is an important part of masculinity. Like part of how we learn to be men is how we learn from one another what's acceptable to be a man, what's acceptable in terms of masculinity. So we're going to be kind of unpacking some of that stuff today. I'm terrified to come over this thing. I feel like it's going to scream at us again. Oh my gosh, it's the argument for your summary papers. It's right here. I've read so many of these things where they complain that no, the person didn't put it in clearly up front. This is the argument. It's right here. Okay, so my argument then for today is that interdisciplinary gendered analysis gives us this particular way to understand how masculinity works in ourselves, in society, in the ways that we treat one another, okay? So once we understand that, we can think about how we can reject some of its most toxic effects on ourselves, on one another, on our society, right? So we'll do a little of this today, and then the question at the end becomes, will you enact a future that we all deserve, where more lives are treated with respect, more lives are livable? Or are you going to be dominant masculinity's bitch? What do I mean by that, right? What do I mean by that? Are you going to be dominant masculinity's bitch? What does it mean to be somebody's bitch? Okay, slave, so permanent subordinate. What else does it mean to be somebody's bitch? Okay, to submit to some sort of authority, right? And, of course, this is a very gendered term, right? To be somebody's bitch, right? It's either sort of a, right, intensely misogynistic term in this context, right? Misogynist meaning sort of woman-hating, anti-woman, right? Antipathy toward women. Or it's a homophobic statement, right? That you're somebody's bitch, right? A man who has been unmanned by another man overmanning them, right? Somebody's bitch, Okay. So I'm intentionally then using this word here in a way that is provocative to mark to you that we are all in some way beholden to the codes, and men and women, to the codes and rules of dominant, what I'm calling for today, dominant masculinity, and I'll define that in a bit. And the question is whether we think we get more powerful by expressing our allegiance to dominant masculinity, right? Or whether we realize that we're actually being dupes of it, right? That by giving into it, what we're doing is being dominant masculinity's bitch. We're letting it be the thing that gives us, that authorizes what we do. So let's think about that. Do you want to do something that's more expansive? Or do you want to be dominant masculinity's bitch? Because for a lot of you guys, you're going to be figuring this out in college. All right. So what is women and gender studies? Well, I put this link to this slideshow up on the meta site for the class. So you can certainly go there. Every lecture group can check it out. And there's lots of links embedded in it. That will link you to the WGS department page. But in a nutshell, women's and gender studies is the interdisciplinary study of how gendered power, intersecting with things like race and class and sexuality, ability, disability, nation, other valences of social meaning-making and difference, how gendered power saturates everything from our most innermost sense of self to the broadest systems and structures of society. And once you understand that within women's and gender studies, because we come from a trajectory of scholarship as connected to activism, like we are not a field that says we have to be objective at all times and neutral at all times and everything. No, we understand that if gendered power saturates everything from our innermost sense of self to the broadest systems and structures of society, that we need to do something about it. We need to intervene in it. We need to use our production of knowledge to apply it in ways that make more lives livable, that expand the possibility of what it means to be human, so that more people can lead full and successful lives. So that's what women and gender studies does. So if that's something that's interesting to you in any way, I really encourage you to take a class in it. When Scott said that me as a teacher, that I'm transformative for students, I have to say it's not so much me, it's that I'm in a particularly dynamic field that will touch your life in a particular way. Whether you want to become a major or just take one course in it, you should do it while you're on this campus because it will mean a lot to you, okay? And it will mean a lot to the way you treat other people in the world. So, right, here we have something that illustrates that, right? Using the matrix, this theme that we've had since the beginning of the semester, right? So here's this female student. She's suddenly starts to realize that there's systems and structures and meanings embedded in what she had before now just treated as her everyday life. And she's starting to see them, right? She's like, oh my God, it's everywhere, right? The meanings behind things. And so then this other sort of person comes up, right, on her big wheel and says, this is the patriarchy, a social interactive construct that bombards us with misogyny, right? Antipathy towards women. It's a program of domination that permeates all levels of society, right? Here's like sort of downplaying, hey, little lady, in the workplace, right? The ha-ha, right, in school, right? The, oh, here's the patriarch, thank goodness, he's making meaning for, right, the incubator and the minions, right, of his will. So it locks people, this patriarchy, right, locks people into these rigid gender roles of what you're supposed to be if you're a man, what you're supposed to be if you're a woman. And this leads people into this kind of antagonistic relationship, as if there's supposed to be a battle of the sexes where men and women are fighting it out for who gets to be right, and who gets to have authority. And instead, right, leads us into this place of alienation, of distance, of misunderstanding with one another. So she's seeing all this because it's being explained to her. Right? Most people can't see the patriarchy because they're too immersed within it, right? You just think it's the way things are. You just think it's reality, as opposed to this construct. this system of power that we're embedded within. And so she realizes, right? She says, am I a colluder? It's like, well, everyone's a colluder, right? It's like capitalism. We're soaking in it, man. You can't get outside of it, right? That's how patriarchy is. We're all in it. But you're awake now, right? Now you can see. What I'm hoping to do for you today here is give you just one way to see how gendered power operates in society and in you and in your interaction with others. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So then your choice is, what are you going to do about it? Okay? That's what we're doing today. So I want to say something quick about, this is the first year I've done this with this particular talk. I want to say something about the so-called men's rights movement. Okay? Some of you may know what it is. Some of you may not know what it is. For like a decade now, there's been a sort of, because of the internet, a newly empowered so-called men's rights movement that suggests a variety of things. But one of the things it suggests is that men are the real victims in society. They are persecuted. Suicide rates are higher among men. Oftentimes rates of unemployment are higher among men. Men are, more women than men go to college now. When men bring up issues of domestic violence or sexual abuse, they're often made fun of or laughed at or denigrated or not believed. And they take all of these things that are empirically true, right? These are this is fact that these things occur. And they turn it to say, and so therefore the problem for men is women and feminism. Okay? So women are liars. They say no when they mean yes. They say yes when they mean no. They're manipulative. They really all want strong, big alpha men with six-packs who dominate them, but they say that they want to have best friends as their boyfriends, and they're full of shit. And if you just kind of pull back that veneer, right, of what they say they want, you'll actually be able to get to what they want, which is your sexual access of them, right? That's part of the story of the so-called men's rights movement. And there's been this blog that's been created in the last few years called The Red Pill. And I felt like because we started the semester with this metaphor of taking the red pill, I felt like it was socially irresponsible of us to present that to 200 first-year students and say, go take the red pill. Because if you're like, what does that mean? I've never seen this, like this Matrix. It's like from 1999. Like, when is this movie from, right? That you'd Google taking the red pill. And the second or first thing that would come up is this blog. So I just want to pop over to it real quick. Maybe. Uh-oh, where's my, oh, there it is. Doot. Okay. So here it is, and we're not going to spend a bunch of time on it, but it's coded with things like blue pill example, meaning if you're deluded and you believe in feminism or you believe that women should be treated as fully human or any of those things, right? Gives examples of that. Red pill example, how I was able to be a real man and take charge of my life in spite of the feminist conspiracy against men. And so on and so forth. There's a bunch of stuff here. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but I do want to just briefly say the main issue I have with the so-called men's rights movement is not that men suffer and experience suffering and harm because of gendered power. We do. We experience that harm. My problem with the movement, so-called movement, is that it then takes the cause of that suffering, which is dominant forms of masculinity and the ways in which they constrain and injure all of us, and projects it onto feminism, and particularly and especially more generally onto women. So it recognizes the symptom, but misrecognizes the cause. And in order to do so, It does all of these things about sort of cherry-picking evidence and data, taking one person's sort of subjective experience and universalizing it as if it's so, coming with a foregone conclusion, and then finding the things that confirm that bias, and then saying, see, I told you. And the way that the internet works, the one person or the 10 people who have these thoughts and feelings can now come together as the 200, the 2,000, the 10,000 people. And through the internet, they can then say, we are a secret underground movement of what all men really know to be true. And this has incredibly toxic effects. Does anyone know what Gamergate is? No? Yes, Bobby. Bobby in my class is always my go-to. You always raise your hand for everything. I appreciate it. Bobby, what is Gamergate? Okay, so you know that it exists. Thank you. Does anyone else know what Gamergate is? Okay, so this woman who is a games designer, right, computer games designer, breaks up with her boyfriend, who's also in the gaming industry. It's a messy breakup. He goes online to write this screed about her. Other guys who are part of the so-called men's rights movement are like, yeah, she's a fucking whore, right? She's a bitch. Let's like gang up on her and make her suffer. And so they find like her home address and send terrible stuff to her. And anytime she does anything online, they're constantly posting things like, we should rape you and kill you and you should die and you should have dick shoved in your mouth. Blah, 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 blah. Constant, horrible, constant stuff. And this became, it's called doxing. This became a tactic that was picked up by, not Trump, but some Trump supporters against Jewish people, against women who stand up against Trump, against Muslim people, against people who speak on behalf of immigration, against people who speak against the men's rights movement. Okay? So what happens in this movement, taking the red pill, is that it collectivizes what I see as sort of a pathological way of tragic misreading of the cause, and then mobilizes that to attack those who oppose it. Okay? So feel free to check it out if you want, but I wanted to spend just a few minutes on that before I moved forward. Okay. Okay, so what is masculinity? I think that's where we are. Yeah, okay. Oh yeah, and if you're in your section, you want to click through on this one, there's another little Easter egg here, which is a great Portlandia new clip that's like two white guys who decide they want to be a part of the men's right movement. And they have this great song that's like, what about men? It's really funny. So if you want to look at it, it's there in your section. Okay. So what is masculinity? Well, according to gender studies, which draws upon psychology, sociology, biology, literature, film studies, all sorts of different fields in order to sort of understand these things, there's a few things you need to know. First of all, we don't have a gender, we do gender. Like we often think, right, that we all have a gender. I'm either a guy or I'm a girl, I'm masculine, I'm feminine, I just come into that. Well, sociologists like R.W. Connell and others have explained that actually we do gender. In other words, gender is a kind of performative act that we engage in, right? And we engage in this act over and over and over again to the point that it seems like it's what we are, right? But it's an act that we engage in. I'll give you an example of this. So when I was in high school, so I'm gay, woohoo. So when I was in high school, I didn't exactly know I was gay, right? I didn't want people to know I was gay. I didn't want people to think I was gay, whether or not I figured out if I was gay at that point. So I realized that, like, I looked at the other guys around and was like, who are the guys that nobody's going to think are gay, right? And I realized they walked a certain way, right? And so I noticed that like they put their shoulders back and they put their pelvis kind of forward a little bit. And you keep their head kind of a little bit stiff, right? And they kind of walk like this, right? Like, hey, what's up? Right? And so like that's how I, for like 2 years, this is how I walked in high school, right? I was doing gender, right? And then, like, as I started to come out, I was like, oh my God, I get to have all this freedom of movement. This is amazing, right? Like, wow, right? And that's also doing gender, right? I mean, one of the most liberating things, like, in an embodied sense for me was a realization that I could use my wrists. Like, wow, that's amazing, right? These are articulated, right? So we all do gender in all sorts of ways, knowing and unknowing, right? So we do intentional things, but we also play into the scripts of gender, right? So there are things that tell us this is the way you're supposed, society tells us, peers tell us this is how we're supposed to be, right? And we act into those or we act against them, but we can't just avoid them. Because of that, like they're ceaseless acts. We have to constantly do gender. And in doing gender, we express allegiance to one script or another, one schema or another, to reference last class, right? We know ways that we're supposed to or not supposed to be men or women, and we play into those. And gender theorists and sociologists and psychologists have talked about how what this does is it produces our gender identity, right? We know who we are as a gendered person in the world because we ceaselessly perform these acts. They play into certain scripts. We receive recognition for our success at doing those scripts or our failure at doing those scripts. And then we know that's what we are, our gender. And this happens through these ideologies of gender, but also institutions of gender, right? Think about, as a very basic institution of gender, the bathroom, right? Every time you go into a bathroom, unless it's a gender-neutral bathroom, you're expressing your allegiance to gender, to doing gender in a particular way, right? If you're pledging, you're like, I want to be a part of the Greek system. Well, guess what? You got to be in a sorority or a fraternity, right? You are expressing allegiance to gender scripts by doing that, right? So there's ideologies, there's institutions, but there's also the interpersonal sort of connections you have. How are you being validated, affirmed, or alienated, right, by others around you in the way you do it? And then you internalize that as if it's you. It's coming from inside you out. Okay, second thing. Did I just skip something? Let me see. Oh, looks like I can't go back. Too bad. Okay. Second thing is that masculinity is contingent. It's culturally contingent. What is normative masculinity has changed over time and place. And wow, we have a great example in American-born Chinese, right? Where, right? He's like, ha ha, Jin loves a girl. It's like, so? And he's like, well, in Taiwan, right, we laugh at boys who say that they like a girl before 18, right? So, ha ha. And he's like, this isn't Taiwan. This is America, right? Guys are supposed to like girls from like right out of the womb, right? So right, he accuses him of being fresh off the boat, right? So he's like impugning his American masculinity, like he's failing to do the scripts he's supposed to, right? And then suddenly, what, right? Wei Chen is like internalizing and then doing the script of American adolescent masculinity better, right, than our poor main character, right? So there's contextual sort of rules, right, or contingent rules of what's validated in different times or places. And because there are differences, there's always going to be there's always going to be some forms of masculinity that are privileged. And then I give you, right, so one of the things that masculinity studies has done is said there's not masculinity. There are many different multiple masculinities, and if we want to really understand masculinity, we need to delve into how each of those operates in different ways. How do they relate to one another, right? So I just listed off a bunch here. You don't have to write them down, but so then our own masculinities are conditional and changing. They're not fixed. We don't arrive at masculinity and then be like, boop, done, level up, right? You have to continue to sort of navigate it constantly. And so, right, masculinity finally it's a disciplinary thing. You are disciplined by it, right? Everybody has to pass in some ways. You can't actually possess masculinity. You have to act into it all the time. And there are certain kinds of it, certain ideals of it, that get positioned as if they are the right way of doing masculinity, the most normal, natural, and dominant way of doing it. Oops. So this is really crucial. So all of us then are always being shaped by either our proximity to this dominant kind of masculinity or our distance from it. What is the dominant kind of masculinity? Well, it's the alpha male, right? Dominant masculinity is powerful. It's where the body is the instrument of the mind, not some sort of dependent thing, but rather, right, an instrument of my will. It's where I'm in command of myself at all times. It's where I'm out there being the earner, right? It's where I can walk in a room and people pay attention to me, not because I'm seeking that attention, but because I'm the man, right? It's about being strong. It's about controlling your emotions. It's about being able to have access to women when you want it, right? It's certainly about being straight, right? So these are all things that are part of what dominant masculinity is. And we're all being shaped by either our proximity or our distance from it. So whether you're white or African American or Asian American, Latino, whatever, gay, straight, trans, disabled, fully able-bodied, right? You are in some kind of other sort of form of masculinity that has to relate to this dominant form of masculinity. We all have to answer in some aspect in relationship to it. So the question becomes, do we lean into it? Or do we resist it? Or do we try to ask for something more than it? This is crucial too. So we all exercise masculinity. Men, I'm talking about in particular here. Sorry, not we all. Some ways manifest what psychologists of gender call hostile sexism, right? Hostile sexism is like, you stupid bitch, right? I am in control of you. Women are stupid. Men are strong, blah, 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 right? Women should be in the kitchen, da, 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 right? Benevolent sexism is when you say, oh, you poor vulnerable thing, I need to take care of you. I need to protect you. And look how much of a man I am because I'm totally being a good guy here, right? Those are both sexism, right? Those are both expressions of dominant masculinity, right? Okay, which leads us to the masculine paradox, okay? And this is the thing, this is where I think the red pill folks really trip up and don't actually take the real red pill, but just take their own little blue pill, right? So the masculine paradox is, and sociologists like Messner talk about this a lot. Jackson Katz talks about this a lot. Because of male privilege, that is, because we live in a society that privileges the status of men structurally over women, men as a group are powerful, okay? And just to give you a quick exercise of the fact that male privilege still exists, because you could say, wait, men and women are equal. We should just see all people as human, right? By a show of hands, how many of you women in the room, how many of you would walk across campus at night and be keeping an eye on your surroundings, trying to make sure that you're safe because of the possibility of sexual or other forms of violence? Okay, everyone, I want you to look around and see this. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you as men walk around at night on campus and keep guard around yourself and pay attention because of the potential fear of sexual violence? Okay, that's male privilege in operation, right? If male privilege didn't exist, women could be in a short skirt with no panties, passed out drunk on the quad, and no one would hurt them. that's not the world we live in. So male privilege exists, right? Male as a class of people are powerful and are made to feel we're supposed to be powerful. But because of dominant masculinity's unattainable expectations that we're supposed to be this fully autonomous, empowered, sort of powerful being, we can never get that. So as individual men, we feel powerless. We feel done wrong by the promise that we're supposed to feel powerful, but we don't. So as a class of people, men are given power in society. But as individual men, we often feel powerless about one thing or another, right? A perfect articulation of this is the so-called friend zone. Okay? The friend zone, right, is this idea that you want to be friends with a woman, now you want something more, but you're always the one that gets put in the friend zone because you're the nice guy, right? That's the friend zone. If you take out the expectation that you are entitled to sexual access to women as part of your interactions with them, then it's not a zone, you're just friends. You're friends, right? Like you don't, as a straight guy, when you're hanging out with another guy and you guys really get along well, you're not like, oh man, I'm in the friend zone, we're not having sex. Right? So, right? Male privilege makes us feel powerful. We are entitled to this access to women, right? But I'm not getting it. I'm in the friend zone. Right? So be careful about your language because your language has meaning in terms of how you actually, like, how you contextualize the people that you are intimate with in your life. Okay, so the other thing I want to really emphasize here is that we are socialized into these roles, right? And adolescence and college life are like these incubators of dominant masculinity and its expectations, right? Here we have all sorts of things going on in this little block here, right? You have, right, don't get your panties in a bunch, Greg, little pansy boy, right? Greg has just defended the main character, right? And been like, hey, maybe it's not cool to be super mean to him about his food, right? And then he's like, okay, so like, right, first he tries to sort of, you're a woman, right? Panties, haha, gendered underwear, right? And then pansy, homophobia, right? Homophobic baiting is part of it, right? And so he tries to restore his honor by saying, what did you call me? Right? Not being like, oh, that's cool, maybe I do wear panties and maybe I am a pansy, what's up, right? No, he restores it through like saying, no, I actually have the dominant masculinity here, right? And so he's like, right? And so then how does he restore his place here, right? Explicit racism, right? And sort of the unmanning of him as like, haha, you're like the other. And I think one of the, right, you're less of a man because you're not part of the sort of the dominant white paradigm of manhood here. And there's a long history of the unmanning of Asian men by white culture, right? As effeminate, as tiny penises, as weak-willed, as manipulative, as conniving, as over-sexualized. And we see that in some of the chinky, right, aspects of this book. And I think one of the most interesting people here actually is the guy in the middle, right? Who's like trying to figure out where he's going to fall and then realizes, oh, I can align with both of them if I just yell at that guy, right? So how do we do this? Masculine socialization teaches boys and young men to internalize an imperative to succeed at doing dominant masculinity, right? We want to be able to do dominant masculinity. And this leads us into enacting forms of toxic masculinity, the kinds of masculinity that are harmful to ourselves and others, right? They neglect our our health in order to demonstrate strength, right? Power through it, no pain, no gain, man up. They teach us to express dominance through violence or other sort of more passive-aggressive forms of violence like joking, right? We'll talk about that in a second. Then we blame the harm that we're experiencing from this feeling of powerlessness or the feelings that we get from expressing our allegiance to toxic masculinity. we blame the harm not on the dominant form of masculinity itself, but on others, right? Nasty women, pussies, feminists, right? Others. These are the people that are the problem here. Right? As one example of that, right? Men are more likely to commit violent crime, but are also likely to be victims of violent crime than women. What does that tell us? It tells us that they're engaging in these kinds of toxic masculinity and this allegiance to dominant masculinity. So this imperative to succeed at it is crucial. And then this other part of it is very, very important, which is that we are taught, and this is what's happening here, to engage in disciplinary actions against ourselves or against others when they are not expressing allegiance to dominant masculinity, right? Stop being such a faggot. Stop being such a little bitch, right? So, who's in charge here when you're aping the scripts of dominant masculinity and its toxic forms? Are you being a man when you're doing this? Or are you being dominant masculinity's bitch, right? Are you just playing out a script that has been handed to you and that potentially you are a dupe of? Think about that. Okay, so then there's masculinity. For dominant masculinity to succeed, right, there have to be subordinated forms of masculinity, right? And here I give you an example, right, of Chinky, right? And Chinky is like salacious and like drooling over American women, constantly sort of desiring in these really lecherous ways. And then there's a laugh track constantly going, right? This third audience, which is laughing all the time at Chinky, right? That's part of this. So one form of dominant or subordinated masculinity is people who are racialized as other forms of masculinity that are either hyper-masculine. African-American men are often positioned as hyper-masculine, too masculine, right? To Asian-American men who are often positioned as effeminate, not masculine enough. Gay men, always not masculine enough, right? So subordinated masculinities are marked by their failure to approximate orthodox or dominant masculinity. That's what subordinated masculinities do to shore up the idea of dominant masculinity as if it's natural and normal. Okay? And then there are those that get it permanently fixed it gets permanently fixed upon them, and they're unable to avoid its associations. Right? And so C.J. Pascoe, a sociologist who studied high school students in the Central Valley in the mid-2000s, talks about, in her book, Dude, You're a Fag, talks about what she calls the fag discourse. And she says it's like a hot potato, where what you're doing in the fag discourse is you're making fun of one another in shop or in gym or whatever, and you're like, dude, you're such a fag, you like sushi, or whatever, right? It's rarely about like, dude, you're such a fag because you're expressing your love for men. No, it's always like, you know, you like the color pink, or you like a different beer, or you like apple cider instead of beer, or whatever, right? So it's like, dude, you're a fag, right? And it's a hot potato that's thrown to that person. And then that person, in order to avoid that association being fixed on them, they have to take that fag discourse and pass it to somebody else, right? Call somebody else a fag, get somebody else into the subordinated position. Right? And this goes on and on and on, and this is part of how boys learn how to be men, is to engage in that activity. Okay, wow, I can't believe we're already at time. So I'm going to move through this stuff and past it. I'll just mark it for now. These are different ways that when you are challenged as a man because of your failure to approximate an allegiance to dominant masculinity, these are things that men do to restore themselves to masculinity, right? They're expressing their allegiance to dominant masculinity, right? One of the interesting ones I want to bring up, because I think it's really important for first-year students to realize, I was really surprised when I learned this. It's from public health research about college campuses. So college men who are the worst in terms of their binge drinking, the heaviest binge drinkers, it's been shown that they drink as much as they do in part because they perceive themselves to be drinking as much as the other guys that they're drinking with. But sometimes they're drinking 2 and 3 times more than them. but their perception is they're just keeping up. So, right, so this like way in which like, right, you're drinking to feel powerful, you're drinking to feel like you're connecting to this allegiance, right, this homosocial allegiance to other men, right? Homosocial doesn't necessarily mean gay, right? Homosocial just means with the same sex, social, right? But they're actually drinking, right, at a far greater amount than others, right? I'm going to skip past this. Boop. OK, to get to this part, right? This is the end of my talk. So what can we do about this if we recognize that we don't want to be complicit in it, right? There's a few things we can do. One thing we can do is, how many of you have seen Fight Club? OK, what's the first rule of Fight Club? What's the second rule of Fight Club? OK, right. So refuse the first rule of Fight Club. Talk about masculinity. Talk about dominant masculinity. Talk about the toxic effects of certain forms of masculinity. Nurture resiliency and empathy towards others as opposed to dominance and submission as your models. Cultivate friendships instead of friend zones or bands of brothers that are bros before hoes. Be accountable. Don't be a dick, which is like, right, the sort of a toxic or form of sexism, right? Or a hero, thinking you're supposed to be a hero all the time, which is like benevolent sexism, right? Be accountable to others, including women. Develop dialogues and conversations. A great place to do this is the Hub. Go to the Hub. There's a masculinities group that meets and participate in that. If you don't like what I've been describing as dominant masculinity or toxic masculinity, then don't enact it. Enact in yourself and in your relation to your guy friends and to your female friends what you want the world to actually look like. Because that's what you're doing in the choices that you make. And then finally, I just want to emphasize this at the end. Remember, masculinity studies does not say, as the red pill does, right, that men are the problem. Feminism does not say men are the problem. What it says is that men are not the problem, but certain forms of allegiance to dominant masculinity and its toxic effects are the problem. And if you recognize it as a problem, you have an obligation to do something about it. And so I hope that you will join me in this struggle to create a better world where we can all be more fully free. So, thanks.